A gang of Taoist alchemists were attempting to perform something that had nothing to do with combat in the 9th century, perhaps in the mountains of Sichuan or Shunyi province in China. Their goal was to live forever. They spent years combining, heating, and experimenting with whatever materials they could find, following recipes handed down through generations of mystical and medicinal tradition, because they were certain that the correct combination of minerals might create an elixir of immortality. 3 chemicals were once blended in one batch: sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. And that combo achieved something far more extraordinary than bestowing eternal life. It blew up. The early historical record is replete with stories of burned-down workshops and singed beards, which provide all the information you need to understand how that initial meeting actually transpired. There was no one attempting to create a weapon in the room. The resultant material was dubbed Hui Yao, which translates to fire medicine, a name that, rather than serving as a future force for conquest, still holds the dim, perhaps embarrassed remembrance of its initial intent as a failed pharmaceutical. Nevertheless, that one unintentional batch of unsuccessful immortality medication turned out to be the most significant chemical discovery in human history. The seed that would eventually grow into every gun, cannon, and firearm on the planet. So how did humans end up with a gun after a bad concoction in a twist alchemy lab? The solution involves bamboo tubes that are fastened to spears. A siege that demonstrated the effectiveness of the new technology. The balance of power on every inhabited land mass on Earth was eventually altered by several centuries of meticulous refinement and a slow, steady diffusion of knowledge over an entire continent. Let's begin by defining that early gunpowder mixture as simply as possible, because knowing the fundamentals of chemistry makes it easier to understand why everything that came after happened the way it did. The concoction those alchemists discovered included sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate, sometimes known as saltpeter, in a weight ratio of about 75 to 15 to 10. When heated, the saltpeter acted as an oxidant, releasing oxygen quickly to fuel an incredibly quick combustion reaction that resulted in an abrupt, explosive gas expansion. The secret to everything that gunpowder would later be used for is that expanding gas. That may involve shooting pyrotechnics into the night sky or, in the end, firing a metal projectile from a tube with sufficient force to pierce armor. Gunpowder was not weaponized at all in its earliest known applications. It was utilized for festival entertainment, smoke signals, and fireworks. This is just the kind of festive decorative use you would anticipate from something that was first discovered by monks seeking immortality rather than military engineers seeking an advantage on the battlefield. For millennia, this substance was mostly seen by common people in China as a spectacle rather than a threat, adding color and commotion to religious ceremonies and celebrations that had nothing to do with fighting. When military leaders during the Song dynasty saw what this explosive new material might truly do, it all changed. Chinese engineers created the huochang, or fire lance, between the 10th and 12th centuries. Furthermore, the design was really as basic as a weapon could be. During close battle, take a length of bamboo, securely fasten it to the end of a spear, fill the tube with gunpowder, and light it. The end product was a pole arm that could shoot flame and burning debris straight at anyone within arm's length, making a regular spear far more dangerous to use in combat. During the siege of Dian in 1132, defenders employed fire lances to stop assaulting forces from scaling their walls. According to all accounts, the weapon performed just as planned, burning and confusing assailants in a manner that traditional spears just couldn't match. Just the psychological impact was noteworthy. Suddenly, soldiers who had trained their entire lives to fight with spears and blades were up against an enemy that could shoot fire. And on a medieval battlefield, that kind of shock frequently mattered just as much as the real physical harm done. The rate of innovation quickened after gunpowder was shown to be effective in real warfare, and each subsequent advancement was a very obvious and logical progression from the one before it. Fire lance manufacturers started adding pottery shards and pellets to the bamboo tubes along with the gunpowder, turning a weapon that only created flame into one that also sent tiny projectiles outward with actual force. This was a truly important conceptual development since it changed the weapon's intended utility from scorching and intimidation to actual, distant, physical harm, the fundamental idea of all subsequent firearms. The next significant drawback was the bamboo itself, which occasionally injured the soldier using it since it was unable to withstand the pressure that stronger gunpowder charges produced without splitting or exploding in the user's hands. The hand cannon originated when Chinese artisans discovered how to create bronze tubes sturdy enough to securely handle that pressure. A weapon that launched a single solid projectile with significantly greater force and range than any bamboo fire lance ever could by using the expanding gas from gunpowder burning. In contrast to the earlier bamboo-based weapons, metal-barreled hand cannons were already widely used throughout China by the 13th century, marking a true technological advance in terms of dependability and efficiency. The same fundamental idea was also elevated by Chinese engineers, who created weapons like the heaven-shaking cannon and the thunderclap bomb that could reduce formerly impregnable fortified positions and produce truly high-impact explosions on a battlefield. During sieges like the well-known defense of Qiang in 1232, the Mongols encountered these gunpowder weapons during their invasion of China in the 1200s, and the encounter had a profound effect. The Mongols assimilated the new technology rather than just being vanquished by it. Additionally, they brought gunpowder weapons with them when they advanced westward into new conquests throughout Asia and in the direction of the Islamic world after subduing China and establishing the Yuan dynasty. This is truly one of the most significant and underappreciated technological transfers in history, because Mongol military campaigns operated almost like an unintentional delivery system, transporting gunpowder knowledge over vast distances much more quickly than trade caravans or diplomatic exchanges could have done on their own. In a matter of generations, a Chinese invention spread throughout all of Eurasia. It's also important to remember that during this time, gunpowder weaponry did not evolve in a single, linear fashion. Chinese military engineers created fire arrows and rockets in addition to hand cannons and fire lances. These projectiles were propelled by gunpowder and were used not only in China, but also in Korea and India. They traveled in different but parallel directions from the westward path taken by hand cannons. Unlike the fire lance, which finally vanished when real firearms developed, these rocket weapons never completely vanished. Rather, they continued to exist as a separate area of gunpowder technology, which would reappear in European conflict centuries later. In other words, the history of gunpowder extends well beyond the invention of the cannon and the first progenitors of contemporary military and space rocketry. It splits into two paths, one that goes in the direction of the gun and the other that goes in the direction of the rocket. Both stemmed from the same unintentional discovery made by alchemists who had no interest in either result. Through a mix of trade, military interaction, and the larger wave of cross-cultural exchange that defined the 13th and 14th centuries, gunpowder technology then concurrently moved outward over several overlapping paths, reaching the Islamic world and ultimately Europe. Historians researching this era reveal a more comprehensive trend that is worthwhile. During this time, several significant Chinese inventions made their way to the West, including gunpowder. Over roughly the same period of centuries, the magnetic compass, paper, and printing all followed similar basic paths. Long before the term globalization was used, it was a part of a much greater movement of information and technology from east to west. According to some historians, early European cannons are structurally so similar to Chinese designs that a direct knowledge transfer seems far more likely than separate creation coincidentally arriving at virtually identical answers. When the technology arrived in Europe in the late 13th century, it found itself in a political and military environment that gunpowder weapons would over the ensuing centuries drastically and irreversibly alter, ultimately upending institutions of feudal military power that had existed for hundreds of years. The change didn't happen right away. Similar to their Chinese forebears, early European hand cannons were rudimentary, slow to reload, and challenging to aim with any degree of accuracy. Basically a tiny gun awkwardly fixed atop a pole. You filled the open end with powder and projectile, touched a length of slow-burning cord or a smoldering ember to a tiny touch hole, and hoped, much more optimistically than confidently, that the explosion would actually launch the projectile in a useful direction. However, even in its rudimentary form, the weapon had a practical and psychological impact that was unmatched by conventional combat weaponry. Cannon fire began to destroy castle walls that had withstood conventional siege equipment for generations. A weapon that didn't care how much steel you were wearing, since enough gunpowder-driven force could punch clean through it, made mounted knights in heavy armor, the predominant military force in medieval Europe for generations, more and more vulnerable. Because a relatively inexpensive weapon in the hands of a soldier with far less expensive training could now neutralize an opponent who had spent a lifetime and a fortune preparing for combat in the conventional manner, the entire social and military order built around expensive, heavily armored cavalry started to falter. This change altered the entire structure of European combat, with effects that extended well beyond the battlefield. In historical terms, the conventional castle design centered around tall, thin walls intended to fend off climbing assailants and arrows became dangerously outmoded almost overnight as cannons became ever more powerful and efficient against vertical stone walls. In response, military engineers created the bastion and the star fort. Instead of just standing tall and hoping for the best, lower, slanted, heavily reinforced fortifications are particularly made to deflect and absorb cannon fire. Over time, buildings that were nearly identical to the medieval castle an architectural style that had dominated European landscapes for centuries, replaced it. All due to a weapon that started in the hands of monks seeking immortality half a globe away. The matchlock mechanism's development in the late 15th century marked the next truly significant advancement. And it was this one advancement that ultimately transformed gunpowder weapons from awkward novelties into the foundation of organized infantry battle throughout the continent. The primary issue with prior hand cannons was that they required a lot of coordination and two hands to really fire. While attempting to actually aim at a moving target on a chaotic battlefield, one hand is used to hold the weapon and the other to place a flaming ember or cable straight to the touch hole at precisely the appropriate moment. This was elegantly resolved by the matchlock mechanism, which attached a serpentine, a slow-burning rope held in a curved clamp, directly to the weapon. When the trigger was pulled, the already burning core fell straight into a small pan of priming powder, lighting the main charge automatically and allowing the shooter to hold and aim the weapon with both hands until the gun went off. This may seem like a tiny mechanical adjustment, but since it was the first mechanical firing device ever used on a little arm, it was truly revolutionary. Additionally, it made it possible for a single trained soldier to fire a gunpowder weapon with some actual aiming precision for the first time in history, as opposed to just pointing roughly in the correct direction and crossing their fingers. Matchlock air abuses began to proliferate throughout Western Europe by the early 15th century, especially in Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire's lands. From there, the weapons quickly expanded throughout all of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire, which had been using gunpowder weapons since the 14th century, integrated matchlocks into the elite Janissary Corps, which served as the core of Ottoman military might. They used the weapon to great effect in battles like the Battle of Goa in 1510, working alongside Portuguese forces that also made extensive use of matchlock weapons at that time. Portuguese traders brought matchlock technology to Japan in 1543, and local gunsmiths there perfected the design to the point where Japanese matchlocks, known as Tanegashima, were considered some of the best-made weapons in the world at the time. Even European observers were impressed by their accuracy and skill. A truly peculiar and fitting historical loop for a technology that started as a failed immortality potion in the same general region, China itself, having initiated this entire chain of innovation centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own original invention, creating matchlock weapons known as birding guns specifically to counter ongoing Mongol incursions along its northern frontier. Matchlock muskets, which could weigh up to 25 pounds in some configurations, eventually became heavy and powerful enough to require a forked rest simply to support the barrel while aiming. However, they could punch through plate armor at ranges that rendered conventional swords and pikes increasingly obsolete on an open battlefield. Musketeers usually needed protection against melee attacks, which were typically supplied by pikemen standing next to them, because reloading and shooting a matchlock took a long time and left the user momentarily vulnerable. From the 16th to the early 17th centuries, this combination of pikes and shot came to rule European battlefields. A complex, meticulously planned tactical system that calls for a great deal of training in order to successfully coordinate with musketeers firing from behind or between rows of pikemen in closely spaced formations. Because they lacked the resources or the particular tactical incentives that propelled European armies toward this particular evolution in organized combined arms warfare, many armies outside of Europe that had adopted matchlocks kept their traditional formations instead of developing the same dense, disciplined infantry coordination. Everyone who used the matchlock knew right away that it had one glaring, enduring flaw. It gave away a soldier's position in the dark, required constant control of burning cord even when nothing was happening on the battlefield, and required an open, slow-burning flame at all times, making it almost worthless in damp weather. Through a number of intermediary phases that are worth comprehending, the solution eventually emerged. The wheel lock, which was created in the early 16th century, completely eliminated the need for a constantly burning match by using a spring-loaded wheel that spun quickly against a piece of pyrite to produce sparks. For cavalry who required a weapon they could carry loaded and ready without tending an open flame while on horseback, this made wheel locks much more useful. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, English cavalry regiments and German mercenaries became especially linked to this system. However, because wheel locks were costly and mechanically complicated to produce, they were never able to completely replace the simpler, less expensive matchlock among regular soldiers, who continued to use the older, less expensive version well into the next century. The flintlock was the real breakthrough, even if wealthier cavalry soldiers rode with the more sophisticated option. Morin Labourgeois, a French gunsmith, is usually credited with creating the mechanism in its unmistakable modern version between 1610 and 1615. The flintlock created sparks that ignited the charge by striking a steel surface known as a frizzen with a spring-loaded hammer that held a piece of flint. Because it was quicker to use than a matchlock, far more dependable in bad weather, and didn't require an open flame to maintain, soldiers no longer had to reveal their location in the dark by carrying a lit weapon. The Dutch States Army was among the first in Europe to legally adopt the flintlock mechanism as a standard-issue infantry firearm around the 1630s. And in a matter of decades, it had emerged as the most important weapon in practically every major European military. This status would last for about 200 years, during colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution that followed, in which flintlock muskets carried by both British regulars and colonial militias defined the entire conflict from beginning to end. The introduction of the flintlock was accompanied by another truly significant innovation, the socket bayonet, which was first used in the late 17th century. Unlike earlier plug bayonet designs, which plugged directly into the muzzle and prevented the gun from firing while the bayonet was attached, the socket bayonet attached around the outside of the barrel via a metal ring. A soldier could attach a bayonet to his musket and still fire it normally thanks to this seemingly insignificant modification. For the first time, a weapon that combines both close combat and ranged firepower. It had a huge practical impact. Because every soldier with a flintlock and bayonet could now serve as both a shooter and a spearman depending on the situation, armies no longer needed specialized pikemen standing by their musketeers for protection. Together, these developments, sometimes referred to as the infantry revolution, simplified training, streamlined logistics, and fundamentally altered how European armies were organized on the battlefield, enabling regiments to become more adaptable and capable of engaging adversaries in close quarters or at a distance without having to completely reorganize between the two fighting styles. On the battlefield, the bayonet charge also carried a unique psychological burden because the adversary was frequently demoralized by the sight of an advancing line of men brandishing fixed bayonets before a single shot or thrust even made contact. The percussion cap system, a tiny metal cap with a shock-sensitive chemical compound that ignited instantly when struck by a hammer, brought an end to the flintlock's roughly 2-century reign in the early 19th century. This system completely eliminated the need for loose priming powder, flint, and steel. Within a few decades, this last invention in ignition made all earlier mechanisms, matchlock, wheel lock, and flintlock, virtually obsolete. And it was the final significant turning point in the centuries-long series of improvements that had started in 9th century China with monks seeking immortality. From that point on, the rate of change only quickened, resulting in repeating rifles, quick developments in manufacturing and metallurgy, and ultimately weapons that would have been completely unrecognizable to the soldiers who had previously waited in orderly lines with matchlocks and pikes. From a Taoist alchemy lab in 9th century China to flintlock muskets ruling European battlefields almost 8 centuries later, the history of how humans invented firearms is essentially a tale of accident, accumulation, and migration occurring simultaneously over a vast amount of time. On the first day, no one set out to create the rifle. A group of monks seeking immortality almost burned off their own beards when they came onto an explosive chemical reaction. As military engineers saw that explosive reaction, they gradually came to the conclusion that its severity could be directed, first via a spear-strap tube, then through a cast bronze cylinder, and finally through increasingly complex mechanical systems intended to more consistently, swiftly, and safely ignite the same fundamental chemical process. Each improvement, from bamboo to bronze, from open flame to spring-loaded mechanism, from matchlock to flintlock, addressed a particular real-world issue that engineers and troops had actually run into with the previous iteration. It didn't require a single, brilliant moment of complete innovation. It took centuries of gradual improvement transported across continents by trade routes, military operations, and the kind of gradual cultural interaction that subtly transforms the world while no one is paying enough attention to see it happen in real time. Chinese engineers, Ottoman janissaries, European artisans, Japanese gunsmiths, and Mongol conquerors all passed hands. Along the process, each group made their own improvements. The weapon that would eventually overthrow mounted knights, change the design of castles, and ultimately decide the course of continental conflicts and colonial victories over several centuries started out as an error, created by individuals who had no intention of creating a weapon.